and gentlemen, roll up for what has to be, I know I'm English, but I don't actually sound like that, the most ridiculous, over-the-top, overkill gaming PC we've ever constructed on this channel. It all starts with this, the brand new RTX 5090, and this one is the most over-the-top one you can get pretty much. This is the MSI Suprim Liquid, so it comes with a freaking 360 radiator on it. We've got a godlike motherboard, and just everything really is going to be the absolute top of the top, best of the best, and it is going to cost a lot. We're going to have a little money counter at the bottom left-hand corner of the screen all the way throughout this video, so if you want to explore what endless funds can get you, then this is the video for you. As always, we're going to be walking you through all of the components and everything that we have in here, showing you how to construct it, and then of course at the end, not only showing you how beautiful this thing is hopefully going to look, but also those all-important gameplay benchmark numbers, so you can see what the most overkill gaming PC will actually be able to deliver when it comes to raw FPS. I assure you, ladies and gentlemen, that this thing is going to be pretty spectacular, so roll down your windows, I was going to say, if you're watching this in a car. And buckle your seatbelts, because this is going to be a pretty awesome ride. All that's left to say is a massive thank you to you guys for watching, but also to MSI for proudly sponsoring this video. Let's waste no time though and get started with the bit that you're no doubt most interested in. What has to be the most overkill graphics card ever. This is the 5090. This specific one, of course, is the Suprim Liquid. You can buy an air-cooled version of this that is still called the Suprim, but obviously that does not come with the 360 rad, and that is going to reduce the thermals that you've got, reduce the amount of noise. I've actually already used this one. If you want to see like a head-to-head versus the Founders Edition and a different one from a different AIB, you can find that in the top right corner of your screen. But I think you'll agree it's a really attractive GPU, especially if you're going to put this in a vertical GPU mount. It's kind of exactly what I want. I want something that's almost like reminiscent of the Founders Edition from 20 series, right? I think that was kind of like peak graphics cards for me in terms of like simplicity and just that kind of metal look. And they've definitely recreated it here, and I really, really like that. You will have to obviously be aware that whilst it's a smaller GPU than some of its competition, obviously you've got quite a bit of extra height here, so if you're going to put this in a specific case where you can fit a 360 and maybe a smaller card, do bear that in mind. But obviously, that is only half the equation, because also inside the box, you do get the 360 rad as well. I have changed this round, so you can see the fan labels if you use this as an intake and have the fans on top, but if you're using this as an exhaust, or you've just got loads of options really, then you don't have to see the labels. I'll point that out there now, because that was something that I noted in my previous video that's a little bit annoying, but you should be able to get around that in a normal chassis. And I wouldn't normally be so boring, but I do also want to shout out the fact that MSI do give you one of their yellow tipped power adapter cables inside the box, which is a nice touch because essentially it just increases the safety. Not only does it look like some of these pins are a little bit further forward, so compared to 40 series, the adapter you get inside the box is going to be a little bit safer, but also with this yellow connection, it just enables you to see whether you have fully inserted this. If you can see any yellow, you know it's got a little bit more distance to go in. I will say that this is different though to the one that you'll get with the Founders Edition, and to be honest with you, neither of them are perfect, because this one is short, but at least it is so short that you kind of just tuck it there like that, and that goes to the graphics card. Whereas with this, it's longer, which is good, but then I find it's still not long enough. So where you've got that little cable management section at the bottom of your case, you then kind of have to try and put, depending on whether it's a 5090 or 5080, 3 of these in this tiny little hole, and it's still not ideal. So personally, next gen, I want to see a longer adapter than this with like the yellow tips of this. Blend them together with polymerization, that would be perfect. But let's carefully place our graphics card down for a second, because we know what I'm like, and I do not want to knock that off of our desk, because it would be a very expensive mistake. And instead, let's actually start our build. And I want to say that in all my years of building PCs, I don't think I've ever actually used MSI's top of the top, their godlike range. So if you were to say, what features does this have? The answer would be yes. It's ridiculous all over the top, and actually, it looks very tasteful. Now, obviously it is eATX, so extended ATX, so you do need to make sure your case does have a little bit extra length there just to be able to support it. But this does up to 4 This does up to 4 M.2 PCI Gen 5 SSDs. The way it does that is 2 native slots on the board itself, and it does come with a PCI Gen 5 card that will go into this lower slot, and then you'll get 2 M.2s from that. And you do have an additional 2, I believe, Gen 4 slots as well. So 6 SSD slots in total, loads of I/O as well. I mean, look at all those USB-Cs. Look at that. I mean, I use a lot of USB-C. I think the most I ever use at one time is 4, but here we're clearly covered with 5 plus another 2, 7. Obviously loads of USB-A as well. You've got Wi-Fi, you've got 10 gig networking and 5. So maybe if you want to like hardwire into a NAS, connect to a 5 gig local network or something, you can do all of that at the same time. And I've got to say actually that I do like the way that this motherboard has been laid out. Everything seems to come off completely toollessly, which is nice. And it's all covered underneath this shroud. So you don't actually have to kind of see anything really. You think if you went for like Project Zero where everything's reversible, like you plug it all around the back, but you need a case that supports that. And obviously that then creates a load of mess around the other side, which is good and bad at the same time. Whereas if you go for something like this, where all of the cables are pretty much just going to go through one hole here, you kind of create the same effect without specifically needing a BTF case, which is quite nice. Here you can see all of those M.2s, 5 native on the board itself. Oh wow, okay, that's a lot bigger than I thought. Okay, and it's got a fan on it as well. This is like an old school graphics card, isn't it? This is your PCIe card for those additional 5 M.2s. Oh, and look, it's toolless. You just flip these up and then pull them out, and then you put your drive in there. That's pretty cool. Oh, okay, it's not completely toolless. You do still need a screwdriver to get into this, but that's not bad, is it? But let's place our board back down into position and then pick up the CPU. And I will say that if I was filming this in a couple of months' time when we've almost certainly got the release of the 9950 X3D, that would obviously be the perfect companion for this because it's kind of like the most overkill CPU for gaming and productivity. But in the meantime, you're going to have the fastest gaming CPU you can get. This is the Ryzen 7 9800 X3D. It's 8 cores, but it excels at everything gaming really. It's pretty ridiculous. Availability in the States is still not fantastic, but it should get better over time though, because obviously we've just had the release of new graphics cards, especially the 5090 that does kind of need a 9800 X3D because it is still going to bottleneck even with this in certain titles, certain settings and certain resolutions, but it is almost certainly going to be the best choice unless you specifically need loads of cores. Then obviously you could just go for the normal 9950X, and you can actually use MSI's BIOS as well to turn on like a gaming specific mode. So especially if you do have a high core count chip, this can essentially help you eke more performance out of it when you need it. Next up, we're going to go for our SSD, and I must admit we're letting the side down a little bit with this. This is relatively inexpensive compared to everything else because the version I've got here is the 1 terabyte, but obviously if we were going pure overkill, you go for the 4 terabyte. Now admittedly this is pretty much at the limit of PCI generation 4, but I must admit that I have actually forgot to take this little peel off. That would have been embarrassing. Yes, this is not PCI generation 5, but it is at the limit of Gen 4. And for gaming, this is still more than you need really, and you're not going to essentially really see any difference at the moment because the load speeds, if you do have a game that has direct storage, is so quick anyway that if there was going to be a difference, you'd be talking like milliseconds rather than seconds, right? So personally, I would advise going for a super fast drive, but rather than go for Gen 5 at the moment, go for a higher capacity, which is probably going to be more useful. Now, the next piece of our delightfully expensive puzzle is going to be our memory, or RAM, and Corsair Dominator pretty much does fit the bill every time because it is very, very overkill, but it's just so beautiful as well. You can get different tops for these as well, so if you wanted to even like 3D print something to your exact specification, then you can do that with this. That's why it's a little bit like extra on the top. You can take this a little bit off, go for something slimmer, something different. As I say, it depends what you want to get really, but realistically in terms of specifications, I know it's over 7,800 megahertz of pure RAM performance. I don't know how much difference, again, that's actually going to make in the real world, especially on AMD, but one of the big advantages of going for X870E is that it should support faster memory speeds. So I really wanted to kind of push this to the limit because if you are going for a godlike board, that's probably what you're going to want to try and do. In terms of capacity as well, this is 48 gig rather than 32. 32 is still more than you need for a gaming PC, but obviously 48 gives you that little bit extra without the extra cost associated with 64, but maybe 48 gig of RAM is an insult for this overkill gaming PC. Now moving on to our next component, I must admit I'm still a little bit confused about what's going to be best because I did have an idea to use an air cooler because ID Cooling sent out one of their golden edition ranges, and I really thought that this might work because obviously we have black and gold accents on this, but I can't bring myself to use an air cooler on something this high end, even though I think it's going to match perfectly. Once you put it on, you're going to have an extra fan here or here, and I just think it's going to ruin the aesthetic. But I still want to use the fans that they sent out because they're not RGB, but they have this lovely gold ring along the top and the sides, and I think this really is perfectly going to go with the rest of the components, and it's just going to give us a more tasteful looking PC really, because We've got the wood at the front. As I say, we've got gold accent throughout. I think this will kind of let like the components do the talking rather than just RGBifying everything. So what I'm going to do is go for the best looking cooler when it comes to the pump head that still has fantastic performance, but rather unusually, we're going to take all of the RGB fans off and replace them. As I say, it's not normal, but I want to create something that, as I say, is RGB-less really, and it's just really tasteful. But let's prepare our CPU socket by removing the default AM5 mounting hardware. We'll then place our AM5 spacers on top, place the AMD standoffs in the hole, and then screw those down. And now that we have prepared our socket, I believe we are now ready to actually move on and talk about the chassis. And I've got to say, when I first did a live stream with this, so if you want to see like a full build without any edits at all, you can find that in the top right corner of your screen. But when we first did a build with this, I kind of put it in the live stream because this is from a company called ANPX, and the previous one that they did was decent, but it was kind of unremarkable. And I thought that it would be a similar story with this, but it really wasn't. I love this. It's got a really boring name. It's called the V1, but it's kind of like a mix of all of the best cases out there, right? So it's like a mixture of height, fractal with the wood that you have on the front. It's got a bit of NZXT. It doesn't come with any fans. It's available for roughly £150 here in the UK, but it's just so easy to build in. It's got fantastic airflow, and it just looks the business. I think it looks absolutely fantastic with this kind of like hybrid black and white finish. It's great. In case you hadn't already noticed, by the way, this is a dual chamber chassis. So you've got a little bit of ventilation there. Your power supply is going to fit in this space up here. I don't think this does actually support reverse connection motherboards, which is a downside. But I mean, look at this. You've got this little caddy look that you can put SSDs and stick things on, and then you can just remove it when you're building it. If it gets in the way, that's a nice touch. You've got loads of space down here for larger power supplies and loads of bits and bobs. And I mean, obviously you've got the wood bit on the front. That comes off toollessly as well. It's just everything really that you'd want for a pretty decent price for something high end. But let's pick up our absolute unit of a motherboard and drop this down into position. Once you have got your motherboard fitted and screwed down though, it should start to resemble something like this. So you can see you have a little bit of overhang here, but it still kind of ties in and looks quite nice. Some of the issues that you find with some like dual chamber cases, especially ones that have this bit of edge here, is it then can look a little bit weird when you come around to the other side. But actually I think because the I/O is on here, and your cables are all going to be going there anyway, I don't think that's going to be too obvious. And I want to do something I wouldn't usually do, and that's a bit of a test fit here, because I want to work out where is going to be best to have all of the tubes and where's obviously going to be best to mount the radiator for this. So let's drop our 5090 in for now, and then this can either go at the top like that, or at the side. Not optimal for longevity, but obviously you could have that down the bottom like that. If I did have a criticism of this, it's not only that you can see the labels, but they kind of daisy chain together with this proprietary cable. And if they gave you like an adapter or something, or it was just more mainstream so you could swap out the fans a lot easier, that would be more appreciated. I mean, let's grab our Kraken Elite and work out where that can go. Obviously we'll have fans on there as well. Okay, so it doesn't actually look like we can do two 360 rads without having these clearance issues. So one of them is going to have to go down the bottom, annoyingly. Well, it's not quite working out how I want it, but I think I've got the best all-round compromise. We can't do push-pull because there's not going to be physically enough room there. The irony is, if this was not an E-ATX motherboard and you didn't have that extra block there, you would be able to fit some fans in. But as you're going to have to put the cables for power supply and stuff in anyway here, even if you could physically fit it, they'd probably just end up getting in the fans and you wouldn't get that much extra airflow. So I'm going to leave it like this. We can't then fit 3 fans down the bottom because of these tubes, but I should be able to fit 2 fans down here. The problem I was having was the coil, essentially, of the tubing, because if you do it any other way, all of the tube is just kind of there and it's all you're going to see. So even though this has less stuff in it when it comes to other fan RGB or the gold that we have on these particular ones, you're going to see less of that, but you're going to see a lot less tubing, which I think is going to work out and be more beneficial. Oh, of course it is. The gold is only on that side. And if I'm going to use it as an intake, I'll see that side. It's going as an exhaust then. I'm really starting to think that maybe I made the wrong decision and should have just gone with that air cooler, because it's not going to look how I wanted it. But again, this is just the issue with having 2 sets of tubes. It is difficult to make it look really, really good. I think it's going to be okay, but I've discovered something else as well. And again, you guys are not going to like this one bit. And that is, if you have that radiator at the front, you're not going to be able to fit a fan there, which is a real shame. So we're going to have to just do 2 fans. It'll be all right, but I think you're just gonna have to agree that you'd need a bigger case if you really wanted to pull off what we're trying to do here, or obviously use an air cooler or go for the Suprim Air version, and then you wouldn't have any of this issue and you could have the gold fans everywhere. 2 radiators.
I hate radiators.
I think we're now ready to actually get this installed though, and we do have some thermal compound pre-applied on this, so this can literally just go, no it can't. Remove the default Intel backplate, get the AMD one, drop that into position, and then this just literally pushes on top. Big massive nuts.
Big massive nuts.
Secure with a screwdriver. Then we can start grabbing all of our cables, remembering to connect the fans that are on the radiator to the NZXT system so we can control that in the software. And again, plugging all of these things in, the irony is that it would probably be a bit easier normally, but because we have this whacking great radiator there, actually trying to get everything plugged in here is a bit tricky, but definitely doable. Certainly not the absolute quickest build that we've ever done on the channel then, but it is now coming along. All we need to do is actually plug the power supply in, I believe, and then we are done. I've been quite smart as well because, again, the ugly bit is always going to be these tubes here. And my idea was to kind of get them to fall directly below the power supply cable so that when we plug our graphics card in, it's hiding the cable that is going to be there anyway, no matter what, right? So try to have big brain energy there. But moving on to the last and certainly the heaviest component, I think, of our build here today, we have our power supply. This is the AI 1600T PCI Gen 5. Again, definition of overkill on this one. This one can actually supply PCI Generation 5 on 2 different ports, and you've got that lovely gold finish on the top as well. Looks great, MSI stick with that. I'm hoping that the cables on this as well are pretty decent, because obviously this is an expensive bit of kit, and if you have to go out and buy extra cables as well, well, that's just going to be a huge disappointment. But no, we do have lovely braided cables here, none of that horrible rubber or mesh netting stuff that you find on cheaper supplies. This is good to go out of the box. Overkill, but very future-proof. And because this is dual chamber look, we don't actually need to pre-fit the cables. We can screw that down now. And then we can start connecting our cables. And you might be wondering why anyone would need a 1600 watt power supply. Well, MSI is aiming this obviously for gamers, but then also anyone that's gonna basically have 2 5090s in a single system, use it for productivity, AI systems, anything like that really, you can cover it with one PSU, which is not an easy feat. And then because I have already done the graphics card, which as I say, just plugs in nice and neatly, we'll need a little bit of kind of cable tying and stuff around the back. As you can see, I haven't done any yet, but you do have, actually that does look like quite a lot, but you do have some cable tie points, so you can get it down like that, and then obviously you're gonna put the side panel on, and you've got that little door that you can place here to kind of keep everything at bay. So it's gonna be an easy one to manage actually, and obviously the most important bit is the main chamber that you can see. So without knowing whether it works, it's not been the easiest build, but I think considering everything and what we're trying to achieve, basically just by hiding that extra cable, I think this is one of the best looking jobs you could do. But what would you change? Let us know down in the comments below. Let's see if this works. Oh, and I've just realized, you know what I could have done that would have probably made this a lot easier? I could have had the fans behind this bit of wood and then had the whole thing back a bit and probably either fit some extra fans in there or at least just given ourselves a little bit more room. I mean, it's fine, I'm not gonna change it now, but I didn't realize how much room there was here. Well, at least you guys know. Big shout out, by the way, to MSI for actually sending out their new 27-inch QD OLED 4K 240Hz monitor, because we did have their 32, but it was just too big to kind of make these videos with. Whereas with this smaller 27, it fits on the desk as well as me. Do remember, of course, as well, that we are not expecting loads of RGB. We've made that decision consciously. We're going for full tasteful. Have we done it? Oh, I haven't got a display port. That'd be bad. Trying again. We've got some action. Oh, the RAM looks cool, doesn't it? Oh, there we go. I was getting worried then. I was like, oh, it's not done it. It's taken too long. But there it is. New CPU installed. That is some relief because I've spent a long time on this build. But the big question is it going to take our XMP settings? Profile 1, 7800 megahertz. Maybe. It's thinking about it. I think we've done it. How about that? And just like that, everyone, here we are, all set up and ready to go. And I must admit, the PC's come out well, but not quite how I'd like it. I think actually, if If you're very, very creative, then you may well be able to move the radiator back and then still enable you to actually have 3 fans on the all-in-one, just because it will open up a little bit of room. It's going to depend on the fans that you use, and the problem is, and the reason I haven't done it here, is because the cable that actually connects the fans to the radiator on the all-in-one for the graphics card, it's so small and so thin, and all the fans kind of daisy chain together, it's actually not going to be very easy to do this. You can just be aware that I would have preferred a more open standard, really, without having to use adapters or trying to, like, I don't know, solder fan cables and stuff to get together. That would be pretty annoying. Because actually, I think the best solution would have been to use the Lian Li wireless fans. You can find a full video about this in the top right corner of your screen, because these all sync together and they look very tasteful, but then they also have great performance, and you could set them up to be gold fans and they come in reverse blade. So I think actually for the all-out most overkill PC, that's probably the route I would go down. I do also want to draw your attention to the fact that I have actually attached a fan at the back as an intake. It looks okay, but it doesn't look as high-end as I think the system should. As a result, you can see the logo, but that's just to give our CPU cooler just a little bit of fresh air, just to make sure that our temperature's going to come down and we're going to have better noise and acoustics and things. Obviously the wood effect as well looks absolutely fantastic, but you're only really going to see that in the B-roll because it's the other side of the PC. It's got the same problem that the H6 had, where it looks great, but it's only at the right angles and you don't often see that because it's on the other side of your desk. But anyway, let's jump into some games, and what you're seeing here is something a little bit different. This is Hitman, and the reason I wanted to show this is because it's a fantastic looking game. It is something a little bit different, but then also it's on Nvidia's very limited list at the moment of games that support DLSS multi-frame generation. There's 75 games, I believe, at the time of filming, but most of those aren't really games I'd want to play. So trying to look for something a bit different to spice this video up, this was essentially the best we could do. But you can see at the moment running this at DLSS quality, so you definitely could turn this down to balanced or performance, and we're getting around about 103 FPS at absolute max settings. We have all of those lovely ray trace reflections and full, I don't think it's full path tracing in this, but it's definitely like some pretty high-end ray tracing. It looks really good actually, the implementation is nice here. You can see the tattoo on the back of the head in all of its detail. But yes, let's actually show you how the frame generation works. We go into the options menu, we show you the settings that we have. So as you can see, everything is turned up to max or ultra, but this is the setting I want to turn on, DLSS frame generation. So I'm sure you've heard this a million times, but just in case you're not familiar, essentially what this does is use the graphics card to render frames, and then every other frame from the 3rd frame onwards is then going to be an AI generated frame. So this is only useful if you have a monitor refresh rate that is going to actually exceed the frame rate of the game. So let's say you've got this one, which is QD OLED 240 Hertz. If you're getting 160 FPS and you could turn that into 240, great. But if you have 160 FPS, turn it into 240, and you've only got 165 Hertz display, then you wouldn't want to turn frame generation on, because your monitor would then be served up AI frames when it could be served rendered frames, and you can get some weird artifacts and things. The smoothing only works if you have a high-end monitor. And as you can clearly see at the moment, this has made quite a dramatic difference. Our frame rate has gone to 150 FPS or 141, and because we've got that 240 Hertz display, using multi-frame generation in theory is going to help us just to get a little bit extra smoothness to the image. And because you're seeing 240 hertz anyway, you're kind of just filling in like the blank spaces that you wouldn't otherwise have any information. So as long as there aren't any obvious artifacts, it is going to be worth using, providing your latency is good. So my magic formula is, as long as the PC latency is below 55 milliseconds in a single player game, then you are going to have a good experience. But this is one of the games that you have to use the NVIDIA override in the NVIDIA app to actually get working. So let's stop this recording. Where remember we're getting about 140 FPS. Then we will open up the NVIDIA app. We will scroll down to where it says graphics. Here we have all of our games, and you can use the NVIDIA control panel or NVIDIA app to optimize everything if you want. Takes the fun out of it, but if you're new to PC gaming, not going to be a bad option, but it shows you everything you've got here and what they say is going to be recommended. But what we want to do is scroll all the way down to where it says driver settings, and then here we can find DLSS override. And you've got a few different settings and things essentially. So you can actually change it from default to latest. And if there's a transformer model for the DLSS, which is going to be higher quality, but comes with a slight latency, well, slight performance penalty, you can turn that on, or you can do it based on the setting that you want to change essentially. So you've got 3, frame gen, ray reconstruction, and super resolution. So I want to change this to latest to make sure we're getting the best version of DLSS essentially. And then where it says frame generation, oh, actually, latest. I thought it was going to give you all of those different options. Maybe it's under here. Yes, okay, here it is. So the default would be 2x, or you can change it to 3x or 4x. 4x is going to give you the highest possible frame rate, but remember, because this is a 240 Hz display, there's no point us using 4x, which is going to have 3 AI generated frames, because that is going to take us over the frame rate of the monitor itself. So let's change this to 3x, and then we can return to the game, and indeed, you can see that our frame rate has now increased quite dramatically to around about 220 to 240, 250 FPS, which is going to be perfect for this monitor because you want it to stay just below the frame rate ideally to get the smoothest, most fluid experience without, as I say, seeing any of those AI frames unnecessarily, right? And rather interestingly as well, our PC latency has actually improved. And you might be thinking, oh, well, that's because the frame rate's increased. No, don't forget that the AI generated frames don't actually do anything to the latency other than theory slightly increase it. I think this is actually because we've now changed that latest version of the model's 4-frame gen, which is supposed to cut down on latency a little bit, which would make sense because whilst we're now injecting an extra AI frame, we are getting lower latency because of that new algorithm. So that is pretty cool as well. Obviously, it is going to depend on a game-by-game basis, so your results definitely will vary. And in terms of the amount of artifacts and things that you're going to see, again, it depends on the type of game. So Hitman is very slow-paced, so you're very unlikely to see any like horrible nasties and things unless they're particularly obvious. But if you're playing something maybe like a racing game or a lot of stuff is just kind of going on the screen and the algorithm can't kind of interject all of those frames properly, then that's when you're going to start to see some problems. But I just wanted to illustrate for you essentially what multi-frame gen is going to do and when you'd want to use it, because if you set this to 4x and you're getting over 300 and something FPS, then your experience would actually be worse by setting it to 2x or 3x. It all depends on your monitor's refresh rate, but that's how to enable it. But let's now press on to our next title, shall we? With this being some Alan Wake 2. And this is a game that pretty much comes with all of the bells and whistles, right? So we've got this set to 4K, everything max other than ray tracing, which is off entirely. Our DLSS is set to balanced, and we are using that new model. Now, this is a game that has it all built in natively, so you don't have to muck around with having, well, using that NVIDIA app. Everything is pretty much there and ready to go. And at the moment, we're getting a frame rate of around about 120 FPS, so not too bad. This is definitely one of those games that is ridiculously intense, even without the ray tracing turned on when it's turned up to max. So I would actually advise turning the DLSS down to performance. This is the way that I played through, but that was actually with the older model as well, which gave you better performance, but came at the cost of image quality, which is kind of like the wrong trade-off. So I'd actually rather go maybe from DLSS balanced now down to performance, because the model is better, so you should get better image quality anyway, right? It's worth experimenting with. So just to illustrate this point, if we go into the options menu, you can change this down to performance, and then when this flicks down, you should see that our frame rate has increased, not actually as dramatically as I would have thought, interestingly enough. Our GPU load is definitely, oh, we've got some weird stutter there. What's going on? What's going on? Our PC's having a freak out. It doesn't like it. I think we're back. I think it was just having a weird moment. But let's now turn on our ray tracing. Let's go with high. I think this might topple it, but then it's a 5090, so it shouldn't do. And what difference has that made to the frame rate? Not actually anywhere near as much as I would have thought. I mean, this is obviously one of the main advantages of this generation. Well, certainly on the 50 series, it didn't make as much difference on the 5080 as we would have liked. But the idea is that the overhead has been reduced because you've got better tensor cores, better RT cores, so you can turn all the bells and whistles on without it affecting your frame rate quite so much. And bear in mind, we're not actually using frame gen. A PC latency of around about 34 milliseconds and 90 FPS. That is pretty darn tasty, actually. What if we go absolute max? That's ultra. And the latest version of this game as well, I believe, uses the mega geometry technique, which essentially is just going to give you better performance. I think that's the main difference. Maybe in the future it's going to give you like higher quality models as well, but essentially trying to ray trace Unreal 5 with all of the nanite stuff is very, very hard and very complex, and their technology aims to give you better visuals, but mainly better performance really in those scenarios. So that is what it's trying to do in Alan Wake. Obviously that has reduced the frame rate a little bit further down now, latency of around about 40. Whether you can notice a difference, especially during normal gameplay, not entirely sure, but you can definitely see just how good looking this game is. But this is another one of the new titles that does come with frame generation. Interestingly enough though, because there's so much foliage in this, it's one of those games that I personally turned off when I was playing the game. I haven't really tested it on 50 series though, so I can't comment so much, but I have seen that Hardware Unboxed commented definitely a lot around like the edges of the flashlight and things, so hopefully it can improve over time. But if you did need extra frame rate, you can set that to DLSS frame gen 2x, and then that increases our frame rate to about 130, 140. If we go to 3x, so now 2 AI generated frames, we've boosted that to 205 FPS. Our latency's gone up to 44, but this still feels pretty decent. You can notice the difference, to be fair. It's not quite as slick as it was, but again, in a slower paced game like this, that should be absolutely fine. You can notice that it does start to fall apart when you wiggle it quite a lot though. Yeah, like, do you see what I mean? You can see those artifacts around the flashlight. And then last but not least, let's go for 4x. So if you had a 4K 360 Hz monitor, this clearly would be the optimum setup, but now we are pretty much saturating our display. I mean, to be fair, actually, you could use it on this because it is still hovering around about 240, 250 FPS. I'd probably leave it at 3x personally, but our latency is still a decent chunk under 55, so not bad. But yeah, you might start to run into some artifacting and things. So just pick the settings that work optimally for you, really. But if you want to play Alan Wake, clearly the 5090 is the best card to do it on. But of course, ladies and gentlemen, I know we jest about it, but we have been testing Cyberpunk now for like 4 years on NVIDIA builds. But because they keep changing the game, that is why we keep using it. And today is no different. So this is currently the new Transformer model of DLSS, which, as I say, looks a lot better. Full path tracing, which is why the game looks absolutely ridiculous. I mean, it's kind of cheating when you have it on a QD OLED monitor as well, because that really does do like the remaining 30-40% of the visuals. If you're looking just to do an upgrade to your system, then actually grabbing an OLED monitor would probably be my first port of call if your frame rate you're already getting is like decent enough. But anyway, back to the game. Around about 90 FPS or so with that highest level of path tracing, DLSS set to performance, but because we do have that new model, the image quality is definitely improved on what it was before. So I would say, especially on a 27-inch monitor, this is pretty much compromise free really when it comes to image quality, but this is without frame generation. So our latency at the moment is 28 milliseconds and FPS is 89. And then as we restart the title, annoyingly in a slightly different area, but maybe we get to the same bit, you can see that our frame rate has obviously increased now to about 155, 153 FPS. And crucially, that latency again hasn't really changed that dramatically. We've added an extra 5 milliseconds or so here. We're now looking at about 33, 35 ms. So not even close to a problem in Cyberpunk. Even with all of that path tracing, it is pretty remarkable. But because obviously we do have the latest version of FrameGen, then we find FrameGen, we turn that to 3x. And one of the problems that you will find as you sort of crank the amount of frames that you have up is that if there are going to be any issues with artifacts, you then get artifacts on the artifacts, so it kind of makes it a little bit more obvious. But yes, around about 211 FPS at the moment as we enter a little bit more of a demanding bit of the game. And because that is obviously 40 FPS under the frame rate that we have on our, well, refresh rate that we have on our monitor, again, this is probably going to be optimal. But just for due diligence, change it to 4x. Now this is going to be 3 AI generated frames, so it doesn't feel like soup. I mean, actually that feels pretty good and it's not particularly obvious, but depending on how contrasty the scene is, it can start to kind of fall apart. So you can see it there, it just ends up being a bit of a contrasty mess if you kind of, well, when you put it at 4x, as I say, it's a lot more obvious than it would be at 2x or 3x, but you can break it if you want to. You just got to hope that the game you're playing doesn't make you break it so you see those artifacts. I'm making it sound more confusing than it should be. But ladies and gentlemen, moving on to the final game in our tests, we have probably the most demanding of the lot actually. This of course is Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. I've started playing it, which is why we are actually in a little bit more of a different scene rather than just the same start of the game that you've probably seen over and over again. I mean, just look how realistic that is. That is absolutely insane. I would say that quite often, especially with like the facial animations and stuff, we're properly into uncanny valley here, because it looks so realistic but something's not quite right sometimes. But I'm not getting that from the environments, literally just from the faces and things. I mean, you can see the lighting here is just so realistic. It's very, very cool. This is absolute max settings, so Suprim everything, full path tracing. Interestingly enough though, we don't actually have our frame generation enabled, and at the moment we're getting around about 95 FPS. So this is the way I would choose to play it, because I would probably play it on a 4K TV, 120 FPS, but obviously you've got your frame gen as well, and once again you can use that NVIDIA override. So that's actually what we've done I've set this to use the latest version of Transformer DLSS and of course the latest version of FrameGen. But I will say that I did notice some weird artifacts actually with the Transformer model, which means that I might turn this back off. I'm not 100% sure if that's what's causing it though, which is weird, but every now and then like there's just some weirdness in this particular game, and in the cutscenes I was getting like bits of blue stripes like either side. This is why I wanted to test it again anyway, to see if it was definitely the issue. But this is why you have to do it in the app at the moment, because it's not native, because they want you to turn it on yourself, and then if you know that's the issue, you can roll it back essentially. But let's turn on our FrameGen and see if that actually changes anything. Here it is, DLSS FrameGen. Remember, this is just on-off because we've used the override to essentially change it. But at the moment, we haven't actually changed the amount of frames that it is going to pump out, just the model that it uses. So there we are, about 145 FPS or so. And obviously, you could boost that in the app if you wanted to change that nearer the 200 FPS mark, which is probably what you'd want to do on this particular monitor. But is this enough of a reason to go for 50 series? In my opinion, not really. Like, if you have a 4090, I don't think I would be making the upgrade to the 5090 unless I was like proper die-hard on everything PC gaming, or I needed 32 gigabytes of VRAM, or if you specifically do have a monitor like this and you do want to be maxing it out all of the time, obviously that is going to make sense, because that's where FrameGen or multi-FrameGen definitely comes in handy, is filling out a monitor like this. But it's obviously a lot of money to spend, so the question goes out to you guys on this. What do you think of the 5090? I know availability isn't great, but if you could get hold of one, is that something you'd want to do? Before I leave you, I do want to give you a quick thermal and acoustic test. So in terms of temperatures, 53, 52 degrees on the graphics card, which is ridiculous, but when you have a 360 as an intake, that's why you'd want to go for this version. The whole thing is whisper quiet. CPU thermal's not so good though, 68 degrees, absolutely fine during gaming, but when you're doing like shader pre-caching or loading or stuff like that, it does shoot up to about 96. The system gets very loud. So clearly, you could optimize this a lot better for thermals when it comes to the CPU. So that's something I'll leave you guys with, but here's your noise test. You know, as close to silent really as you can get, which is absolutely insane. But overall, I think the system looks great, but there is a little bit of work to be done to make this as perfect as I know it eventually could be with some tweaking. But as I say, question goes out to you guys. So let me know your thoughts on this down in the comment section below. Smash the like button if you've enjoyed this. Get yourself subscribed, and we'll catch you in the next one. Thanks for watching.